there, guys. We're going to start our flip lesson on matter. This will become vocab entry number 2 in your vocabulary notebook, so make sure you have your vocabulary notebook handy as you are taking notes on this particular lesson. Remember, when I tell you that this word needs to be part of that vocabulary entry, please make sure you include the word, the definition, and then you have to have a picture, and don't forget, every picture has to have color, okay? Vocab entry number 2, the title of it is going to be matter. All right, and matter is going to be our first word that we will put into our vocabulary notebook. Here in blue and underlined in red is the definition. It's anything that has mass and takes up space. So if you think of an object, you need to ask yourself the question, does the object take up space? And if the answer is yes, then that object is matter. Okay, and I've given you some examples. For example, a cupcake is matter. It has mass, and another word you could use for mass would be weight. They're not technically the same word, but if mass is a little confusing, you can think about an object's weight. And it does have volume. Volume is a space that it takes up, and we're going to do some labs in this unit to emphasize what volume is. So a cupcake is matter. All right, it does take up space. A basketball is also matter, and some objects have more mass and more volume, so therefore they have, in return, more matter. And so Mr. Sturdivant is matter. Now, obviously, he doesn't take up as much space because he's so darn skinny. All right, all matter is made up of something called elements. Elements is going to be the second word in your vocab entry number 2. All right, so all matter is made up of these things called elements, and there's over 100 of these elements out there in nature that makes up everything that is living and non-living. So it could be individual elements, or we can have combinations of these elements in order to make everything that we can think of in our planet and beyond. Okay, for example, helium. We put helium in balloons. Helium is an individual element. Water. All right, is H2O. It's hydrogen and it's oxygen. That's a combination of two elements to make up that particular matter of water. Now, because there are so many, we need to organize them in some way. We can't just have a list. That would make no sense, especially when you have over 100 of these elements. And we have a chart that's organizing these elements by their characteristics. And that chart is called the periodic table of elements. Now, my next slide is going to show you the periodic table of elements. I highly recommend that you go and Google search a picture because it will color code it online and show you how it's organized in a more descriptive way than what I'm going to show you. So here is the periodic table of elements. It's a whole bunch of these little squares that have numbers and letters and all sorts of things in them. And we're going to look at one of these squares in more detail in a minute. Okay, but they're divided up into these squares, and the columns that you see, all right, are called families. And how they came up with families, these families have common characteristics. So all the elements in this column have some things that don't make them identical, but make them related, kind of like your family. Not everyone in your family is identical, but you have certain genes and characteristics that make you common with each other, which is your family. And these elements in the periodic table are the same, okay? All matter is made up of some combination of these elements. This is a point I need to drive home to you, okay? And so for this, periodic table of elements is definitely a word I want you to put in your vocabulary notebook. How you choose to define it is up to you. You can use a definition from the previous slide if you want, but I need to make sure you also include with your definition this statement. All matter is made up of a combination of all of these elements, okay? So let's take a look at one specific square on the periodic table. Okay, so we've taken one square here. You can see that there's a number, a letter, a word, and another number. Okay, the number in the top left-hand corner is called the atomic number. That tells you how many protons this particular element has. Now, the word proton is not something I need you to define. It's simply I need you to know what this number in the top left-hand corner means. And as you look at the periodic table, as the table moves from left to right and down, this number starts to get higher, as does this number at the bottom, and that's the atomic mass. Basically, how heavy is one little atom of carbon, okay? The word proton, though, is something you'll get into much deeper when you get to 8th grade. Every element has a chemical symbol. Sometimes it is 1 letter, sometimes it is 2 letters. There are a few on there that have 3 letters, but those aren't really elements that we use on a regular basis anyway. And then you'll have the name of the element, and then you'll have its mass. Here's another drive home point that I need to make sure that you include in your vocab notebook. All elements are made of tiny parts called atoms. So this carbon is made up of tiny little pieces that make it unique and make it carbon, and those little pieces are called atoms. And the atoms for carbon are different than the atoms for, let's say, nitrogen. Okay, so each element is unique because it has different atoms that make it unique, just like you have different chromosomes that make you unique in your family. So let's compare 2 elements on the periodic table. Okay, we'll take oxygen and compare it to gold. Now here's what I need you to do. At this point in the video, I want you to pause the video and just take a look at the 2 squares and notice any differences you see between oxygen and gold. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and keep talking, but I do want you to stop and sort of take a look at the differences. Okay, first let's look at its atomic number. We have 8 versus 79. When you see those numbers, you would know that oxygen is towards the top of the table because it has a low number, and gold is a little further down the table because it has an atomic number of 79. All right, the chemical symbol oxygen makes perfect sense that its chemical symbol is an O, but not every element on the periodic table is like that. Okay, gold has a chemical symbol of AU. Notice the first letter is capital, the second letter is lowercase, and whoever discovered gold as an element on the periodic table came up with the symbol AU and chose not to use the symbol of a G. Okay? Atomic mass, all right, 15.99, basically 16, and this one is 196. Don't forget, as this number gets bigger, so does this number. Okay? And oxygen is made up of its own special atoms. Gold has its own special atoms. And here's another drive home point. I'm going to want to make sure that you include this as a drive home point as well. Okay? All oxygen atoms have the same mass and occupy the same amount of space, which means they have the same volume. So all matter made of oxygen has the same properties or characteristics because of the oxygen atoms. Okay, so for example, oxygen, it's the gas that we need to breathe. Okay, and water. All right, water has oxygen in it. Those 2 things are similar to each other in their properties and characteristics because they're both made of oxygen atoms. And oxygen atoms in water and just oxygen are the same. Okay, and that's important to know that anything made of oxygen has similar characteristics to something else that includes oxygen because all oxygen atoms are the same. Okay, final slide here, just sort of taking you through a wrap-up of what we just did, okay? First of all, matter is everything that has mass and volume. So it could be your sister, it could be your pencil, it could be the tree that's growing in your backyard, right? All of those things are matter, so that's the big picture. Matter can be broken down into smaller things called elements. All those elements are found on the periodic table, and all matter is made up of a combination of those elements. A few things we're going to talk about with elements. Elements come in compounds or possibly even mixtures. We're going to talk about that at a later date, but I did want to include it for you. And then all elements are made up of these tiny pieces that make them unique called atoms.